This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is returning guest Lisel Hintz, assistant professor of European and Eurasian Studies at Johns Hopkins University and author of the book Turkey, Identity Politics Inside Out. Hello, and thanks so much for joining us, Lisel.
Hi, David. Thanks very much for having me.
You are welcome. We are speaking on Tuesday, June 2nd, the morning after U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to call in the military to halt the protests that have raged across the country since the Memorial Day killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis eight days ago now. In his Rose Garden address last night, Trump described the protesters as terrorists, the same label applied by Turkish officials to the Gezi protesters of mid-2013. Many Turkey watchers have in recent days been highlighting the connections between these two protest waves, both of which emerged under the watch of far-right populist leaders with authoritarian tendencies. On Twitter, you pointed to a 2016 article of yours that laid out how President Erdogan's government in Turkey literally added insult to injury during the Gezi protests. After an aggressive police response to beat back protesters, you explained how Turkish government officials embraced three tools of rhetorical vilification: naming, blaming, and framing. Please, if you could explain how this is done and give us some of the parallels you see in Turkey then and the U.S. today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for highlighting the article. While this is going down in the U.S., as you said, I think a lot of Turkey watchers are instinctively finding parallels. We've been seeing parallels in the vilification of the media and, the sort of encouragement or, maybe violence isn't the worst way of dealing with things, right? And so we're seeing all these parallels. We're seeing the erosion of democracy, I would argue, in the U.S. And so I think it makes a lot of sense for us to draw parallels with Turkey. I want to say at the outset, I'm hesitant about drawing too many parallels. As someone who works in comparativist political science, you've got to know when to find the points of, consensus and dissensus, when things are similar and different. But in this case, I saw the exact sort of application of these three strategies that you mentioned. So the article on Turkey that I write, Adding Insult to Injury, is trying to characterize and break down and specify precisely the mechanisms by which Erdogan is trying to marginalize protesters, delegitimize their grievances, say, this is not something I caused, this is their problem, I have no responsibility to respond to them in any kind of way, I don't have to make concessions, which is, kind of a natural tendency that we see among authoritarian leaders. We talk about, the sort of authoritarian toolbox that leaders have to draw from. So in Gezi, we saw at least what I think are these three strategies: naming and blaming and framing. So the naming is using a really potent, culturally relevant term, something that immediately you can use that paintbrush, you paint that opposition member or that protester with that, and there's an emotional reaction among people who hear it. There's fear, there's rage, there's disgust, there's anger, such that, oh, okay, well, maybe crackdown on them is justified, right? So in Turkey, the word terrorist, obviously terrorism, everywhere has a very, very affective or strongly emotional connotation. But in Turkey, particularly with the war against the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the word terrorist, and of course, this was in Gezi, so this was before the coup attempt when, Gülen's became painted with all kinds of different words. But there was this context,
including terrorist, yes,
including terrorist, right? So and FETÖ'cü and all this kind of stuff. So these are labels, these are names, these are words that you can use that, when applied to someone, is meant to immediately delegitimize their grievances and vilify them. So we saw terrorist, which certainly had a very, very strong cultural context from Turkey from the 70s with the leftist movement, with the PKK later, all that stuff. You also saw, necrophile, which was crazy. You saw çapulcu, obviously, which Erdogan sort of offhandedly used to try and say, this is a bunch of hooligans, this is a bunch of thugs, this is a bunch of, troublemakers. And, one of the things that the opposition so smartly did was turn that back on Erdogan and say, you're going to use that term, we're going to embrace it, and we're going to have it mean peaceful protester. So that naming element is really important, using those culturally loaded words. What we see in Trump is the word thug. Now, thug in the United States has a racist connotation to it. And one of the things that we're seeing in the uprisings, as we saw in Black Lives Matter, and the continuation, the spillover of those grievances, is the perception of young Black men, young African-American men as thugs. The fact that the police, many of the police, not all, but many of the police see them that way, that society sees them that way, and Trump clearly sees them that way. So when he types, "These are thugs" in capital letters, he knows what he's doing. And that's a way of painting those individuals with a very, very dangerous brush. And it also justifies a crackdown against them.
Mm-hmm.
So quickly,
before you go on to
sure.
blaming, if I could just, so have you seen in the U.S. Any of that co-opting that was seen in Turkey, like with Çapulcu? Like, has anybody done that with thugs or with terrorists or with some other name that Trump has called the protesters?
So I wouldn't necessarily say that I can think of examples of that now, but we do see Black Americans taking terms that are thrown against them, used to marginalize them, that come from a legacy of slavery and institutionalized racism, and turning those words around and making them their own. I'm not going to use those terms, but they're definitely terms that, they are able to kind of empower for themselves. And that is a way of symbolically eroding the power of the person who uses it against you. So it's a very, very effective tool of protest or of resistance, I should say, a tool of resistance.
Okay, yeah, please continue. I think you were going on to blaming.
Yeah, absolutely. So, these are interrelated strategies, but blaming is this idea of also marginalizing the opposition by doing it by focusing on their actions or even falsifying their actions. So this can be, again, trying to paint all the protesters as violent, trying to paint them all as malintentioned. And so what you do is you either kind of highlight and amplify if there are any incidents of violence. And during Gezi, there were a few incidents of violence. I observed some of them myself. What was fascinating about it, though, is that there was policing among the crowd saying, don't do that. Don't beat up that bus. Don't intimidate that bus driver. Don't spray graffiti on, it's not his fault. And so there was a policing among protesters to try to ensure that they remained peaceful, that they picked up after themselves, that they took care of each other. And so that undermines this blaming strategy. So what actually happened in Gezi was Erdogan was basically falsifying events, trying to, again, use super culturally sensitive topics, very culturally salient topics, and try to sort of tarnish the protesters with them. So I'll give you two examples. One is the claim that protesters during Gezi, in order to escape the tear gas, that was being washed over them, ran into a mosque in Dolmabahce, and basically they drank in the mosque, they smoked in the mosque. I think I even saw group sex and think of all the taboos you could do to debase this religious and holy place, right? And so these were stories that were perpetrated in the media. They were perpetuated by Erdogan and his followers. And, even the imam of the mosque himself, he's, by the way, since been relocated, but he came out and said, no, none of that happened. This is completely false. I'm not kidding you. They even took off their shoes before they came in a sign of respect, in a sign and a nod to Muslim culture, even though they're escaping tear gas. So, here's a case of a clear falsification, trying to create the image that these protesters are doing these awful, incredibly culturally taboo things, but they're not. The other incident that I point to and that a lot of others point to is the Kabatash incident, in which supposedly a young headscarfed woman with a baby carriage was waiting for the ferry, to cross the Bosphorus. And apparently, and the story, when you hear it, it just gets bigger and bigger. Apparently, some, men stripped to the waist, clad in black, use all the threatening imagery you can imagine. And apparently, they beat her, they harass her, they urinate on her, they threaten her baby. Again, think of all of the culturally insensitive things that go along with a headscarf woman and a baby in Turkey. of course, not just in Turkey, but a headscarfed woman being seen as one of Erdogan's members. He talked about it as though she were his daughter, his girl, and so forth. And so this was an affront on all of his pious followers. Well, the camera footage shows that never happened. She stood waiting to get on the ferry, and she did. So these are, again, these incidents of making up these stories. And so this is the blaming that I'm talking about. In Trump's case, this is a bit different because you did see incidents of violence. You saw the rioting and you saw the burning of buildings that spurred this much larger protest, which is, and I have to say, this is really important, on the whole, very, very peaceful. Yes, this was spawned by rage and frustration and grief by individuals who were rioting against a system that they saw gave them no other voice. And it's important to recognize when you're quoting Martin Luther King that he said that riots are the language of the unheard. So yes, there were some incidents of violence. That is what Trump is amplifying. And that is what the media is focusing on, those kind of isolated incidents of violence. So that's what Trump has been trying to do, is to kind of blame the entire protest movement for these small incidents of violence.
Well, if I just may, if I understood your article correctly, part of blaming, it sounds like, is an effort to claim the moral high ground. And as Trump delivered his Rose Garden address last night, Washington, D.C. police used tear gas and flashbangs to clear protesters outside the White House so that after speaking, Trump could walk to a nearby church and pose for photos holding the Bible. In a tweet, you pointed out how the bishop's response to that Trump photo echoed the response of the Dolmabahce Mosque imam to the AKP government's claim that protesters were drinking beer in the mosque.
Exactly. So the church, St. John's Episcopal Church in Lafayette Square, which is just right across from the White House, where Trump, as you said, was giving that speech in the Rose Garden, where he basically, as you said earlier, used the naming strategy of domestic terrorists. He also called them professional anarchists. So I'll touch on that a little bit in the framing discussion. But the church itself had a little bit of fire damage. And so, he's going to go and stand in front of this religious institution that he thinks that he needs to, create an aura of protecting. So I watched this live. I have not seen anything like that in a very long time. So I watched the protesters be cleared. There were flashbangs. There were, tear gas canisters. People had been just sitting there, kneeling, hands up in the air. And then all of a sudden they're cleared pretty violently. People were injured. There were also reports of rubber bullets. Some people said that they saw people being shot in the stomach. I didn't see that footage. But what you have is Trump with this, posse, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in his camouflage, walking over to this church, standing in front of it and holding a Bible. And Trump literally says, "Get the Bible." Like, he's talking to the photographers, he's talking to the camera people, trying to make sure that they get that image. So this couldn't be a more crafted way of trying to take the moral high ground. That he's got this Bible in his hand, he's standing in front of a church that has been damaged by the protesters. But the problem is it comes off so unbelievably fake and phony. I mean, of course, we're going to go to the fact that he's a reality TV star. Of course, we're going to go to the fact that it seems like he's performing for the camera all the time. But there's also the problem of a lack of any kind of moral congruence. This is where it gets a bit difficult to make the distinction or make the connection between Trump and Erdogan. Erdogan is a pious person. Has he ordered things? Has he undertaken policies that, has he engaged in corruption? Yes, absolutely. But Trump is like taking that, on steroids in terms of, the allegations against him in terms of sexual assault and rape, his on record comments about what he thinks about women, his just, absolutely morally disgraceful behavior. So the fact that he's trying to claim the moral high ground, that's a stretch, man.
So yeah, please continue on to framing, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So this blaming, as I say, he has incidents to work with. There was damage, and there have been, casualties. There have been injuries, and there has been.
Well, actually, yeah. Before you go, sorry.
Yeah.
That to me seems like one key difference of these two protest waves. is that wherein Gezi, despite being called looters by Erdogan, there was very little looting. There was very little violence or acts of aggression. And here, there's been considerable amount of looting, amount of destruction. What does that tell you? Does that mean anything? Does that symbolize anything or suggest anything?
Yeah, so I think this is an important distinction to make. And I think I started my tweet thread on this by saying I want to be cautious about not making too many comparisons. And then, in fact, I see more of the comparisons coming from the government response as opposed to the impetus of the protests. But we have to remember where the impetus for those protests came from. So Gezi starts off as this, kind of small scale environmental protest. They're frustrated with, sort of the concretization of Istanbul and the construction contracts that go along with that and all the kind of, practices that they see as destroying their environment. And so that started off as peaceful, and it was police crackdown on the protesters that fueled this nationwide protest that, as you say, was overwhelmingly peaceful. And again, there was this ethos of, don't do that. Don't use those swear words. Don't, spray paint that.
Right, the Gezi spirit. Yeah.
Exactly. The Gezi spirit, we talk about it being carnivalesque. There were children, there were animals, there was music, there was joy, right? But then, then the Toma, then the police and the tear gas canisters come. So that was a different spirit of Gezi. The spirit that fueled the protests that we're seeing now is coming from rage and grief and frustration and marginalization and silencing and the fact that nothing seems to change, that you have Ferguson, that you have all of these individuals, you have these protests in response to the fact that these African Americans are being killed and that the police are not being charged for it or that they're not being held accountable, and that this continues, that there continues to be this racist treatment of individuals at the hands of the police specifically. So there's a sense that, Black Lives Matter was this gigantic movement, but what have we done if these individuals continue to be killed? And I think one of the biggest frustrations now, what we saw come out of Ferguson, and the protest that followed was the use of body cameras, right? And so the police are being held more accountable for their actions. This is also frustrating. If you look at the number of, the cases that we've had where it seems as though there's a long gap between when an individual is killed and when a video is released and there's footage that proves that the officer did it. And that's the only time they become accountable. So that, I think, is one of the frustrations that's fueling this, that's different than the Gezi spirit. There's a closer connection with the LA riots, the Rodney King riots. There's a closer connection with those kinds of spillovers of rage and frustration. However, I also think that I want to go back and emphasize that some of the acts of violence that we're seeing are, being fueled by accelerationists. They're being fueled by, people from the outside. They're deliberately trying to. There is this movement within the United States, this white supremacist movement that wants to see civil conflict, that wants to see that kind of, clash. And so there are those who are trying to create incidents of violence. I'll just give you a quick example. Of something that's the opposite of that. So yesterday there was this scene of, protesters and the police, and they come closer and closer, and then there's this tense standoff. This is in New York, and a couple of people start throwing water bottles. And one of the leaders of the movement, an African-American man, probably in his early 20s, turns around and says, "Stop it, don't do that. Don't let them paint us that way. Don't let them show us in that way." And then, they end up having a conversation with the police, and the police, I don't know if it was the chief of police, but the individual who was leading them basically takes a knee, and they all kind of kneel down. And it was this individual's, chastising of the protesters, understanding their frustration. Again, those are plastic water bottles, but, they didn't want any kind of...
Let's be clear. He was one of the protesters, yes?
Yes, exactly. So one of the protesters, a man with a microphone, turned around and said, "Stop it. We don't want to use violence. We don't want them to give them an excuse. We don't want to be seen that way. That's not who we are." And that is what allowed those tensions to diffuse. And that is not by any means an isolated case. So you're 100% right to note that the genesis of the two protests is different. But I want to make sure that we have a sense that there is a lot of peaceful protest that's going on. And the scenes of the violence that we are being shown on the media are the exception, not the norm. And that's part of a blaming strategy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry for all the interruptions. Now to
No,
framing, please.
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay, please go to
absolutely.
framing. Yeah.
No, otherwise I'm just like an academic ticking off your article. That's no fun. No,
Sure.
no.
Thank you.
So framing is going to be similar to naming, but it has to do with the wider context. And so framing is a way of connecting the protest to a larger, outside, nefarious, probably well-funded, source of unrest. So in the Gezi case, at the time, we heard Erdogan say, "Oh, these individuals aren't organizing on their own. This is the interest rate lobby that's trying to destabilize Turkey's economy. The outside world doesn't want to see a strong Muslim power, and so that's why they're trying to mess with our economic growth." It then turned into the sort of racist takes, and this was the Jewish lobby, and this was the Israeli lobby. And then later, it started to sort of focus on the CIA, and it focused on George Soros. And every time they mention George Soros, there's an anti-Semitic, I should say, there's an anti-Semitic connotation to it. So there's very much a sense of trying to kind of denationalize or delocalize the protesters and say that these are not actual grievances, these are fueled from the outside. And so one of the ways that we see this happen is linking them again to these sort of, external nefarious networks. Oh, it's the U.S. that's trying to fuel unrest, or it's the Israeli lobby, or whatever the case is. And again, that's trying to kind of make unauthentic the claims of the protesters and say this is coming from the outside. So another example of this is that a lot of sort of discourse coming from the Bahraini government, which is a Sunni minority and Shia minority population, Sunni minority government, Shia majority population, was saying, oh, these aren't, democratic grievances. This is all fueled by Iran. This is just, Iran trying to stir unrest in our country. So you see this happen quite a lot. What we're seeing with Trump and what I've seen in his attempts is a bit different, because here he's not looking to external powers. Now, we know he loves to, link external forces. We know that he really likes to kind of fuel this nationalist rhetoric, and he's anti-immigration, and he, doesn't want to partner with other countries in treaties and alliances and things like that. But this is a bit different. His main enemy that he needs to delegitimize at this point is the Democratic Party, because he's facing an election, obviously, coming up in November. And so he says, oh, this is the work of the radical Democratic left. And he has since then gone and said that this is an Antifa movement. This is these professional anarchists that I talked about earlier. And so again, he's really trying to give a very political frame to protesters that don't necessarily have any political affiliation. You saw this in Gezi a bit as well, where Erdogan was also trying to say that this was fueled by political parties, where in fact, what I saw on the ground was protesters didn't want political parties there. They didn't want, banners and signs and, those kinds of affiliations. They wanted this not to be, perhaps I shouldn't say political, because of course it's political. I should say nonpartisan. And so what we're seeing in the US is that this is not something that, is pre-organized by any kind of party. This was spontaneous spillover of rage and grief. And now individuals who want to support that movement and want to see some kind of change in terms of the existence of police brutality and the institutionalized racism that we see in the United States, but that Trump is trying to say that this is all kind of orchestrated and this is the machinations of the Democratic Party. And so by doing so, again, he tries to make inauthentic and orchestrated and manipulated what's actually sort of a spontaneous groundswell of protest.
Well, I think also Trump has repeatedly blamed Antifa, which you mentioned, but it's not only a far left organization, but it's also originally a German organization or inspired by a German organization. So there is a little element of the external meddler there.
Absolutely. So, but it's external meddlers that are essentially doing what he wants, in the sense of trying to fuel a conflict that he can then say that he can blame on another side, right? So we have seen evidence of Russian meddling in this, of different far-right neo-Nazi organizations based in Europe that seem to have connections to this protest as well. So there may be external influences, but he is kind of pointing to this as the machinations of the Democratic Party, because that is the one that he wants to blame for this.
Because there's an election coming up in 5 months.
Because there's an election coming up,
so
and he's facing horrible criticism over his handling of the corona pandemic and the economy, and he needs some kind of scapegoat, and he got one.
So let's look forward a little bit. You wrote in that 2016 article that, quote, as widespread, broad-based, internationally supported, and emotionally charged as the Gezi protests were, they fizzled out relatively quickly and ultimately produced no lasting political change. And then you add that even after a massive corruption scandal involving AKP leaders later that year, the AKP won the March 2014 local elections and re-secured its parliamentary majority the next year. Do you think that was partially a result of the naming, blaming, and framing? And the U.S., as we just said, has an important election coming up in 5 months. I wonder if you envision the same thing happening here in the U.S.
So that's a really good question. I want to qualify the sort of claim that I made that Gezi fizzled out and that no political change had happened. I'm concerned sometimes how we define change. And so when I say no political change happened, I mean the AKP is still in power. There are lingering effects of frustration, of networks, of, the individuals who are maybe able to come together. I've written about how pop culture can kind of keep the embers of these, frustrations alive. And, we saw the Susamam and Olai rap videos coming out last year, as I spoke about on your program last time, really embodying some of the frustrations of the opposition. So change can take place. It's just that we didn't see it at the top level. And I would say that I do think it has to do with the way in which Erdogan was able to effectively marginalize the grievances of the protesters. But what's really important there is the control of the media, because, he can call them all the kinds of names that he wants, as Trump is trying to do. But we have very different media structures in the United States and in Turkey. Now we have a sort of much more I don't want to say polarized, but diversified media. Yes, Fox News is not only Trump's kind of mouthpiece, but I think he gets a lot of inspiration from Fox News too, if you kind of trace his tweets to what's been said on Fox News. But when you look at the media structure, and scholars like Bilge Yeşil and others have written great stuff on this, when you look at the media structure, it is so intertwined with these holding companies that have construction interests and financial interests and political interests, such that 90 to 95% of the media is basically controlled by the AKP, and that's not even talking about the formal mechanisms of censorship that happen with the Supreme Board of Radio and Television. So the fact that you can sort of disseminate these messages of marginalization is amplified and sort of strengthened by the media's picking up of, the names and the blaming and the frames. So I do think that the ability of Erdogan to quell Gezi had to do with these strategies of basically counter mobilization of protest. But I think the media plays a gigantic role in that.
You mentioned the last time we spoke back in September, you talked about how the wave of online support for those two Turkish rap songs showed how the Gezi energy had not died. It had just sort of been driven underground onto social media. Do you think this means something like the Gezi protests could emerge again, given the right circumstances? Or is it more to say that even now, 7 years later, we have yet to see or understand the full impact of the Gezi protests, and thus perhaps we won't see or understand the full impact of these U.S. protests for several years?
David, that is the $1 trillion question. I wonder this all the time. I ask my students, when we talk about this, is Gezi over? How can we think about the lingering networks that were formed or the sentiments that were activated? How can we think about where those sentiments go when you have an increasingly authoritarian regime and constricted space for political dissent? So while it is absolutely important to understand that Turkey was de-democratizing way before Gezi, what's happened since, and particularly since the coup attempt in 2016, is basically, the public square is off limits for any kind of political dissent. Whatever the march is going to be, whether it's violence against women or it's pride or, anything like that is going to, be responded to with police violence. And so I think a lot of that rage and frustration has gone into pop culture. And I think that's a vessel that keeps it alive. And there are so many tools, with the emotions that the videos evoke and the charged nature of the lyrics and the hidden meanings that they can play with, particularly in rap. So I've got a lot of work that's coming out on this, but I think we want to look at those spaces, those creative spaces of protest. And there's a lot of political science literature on this. And, whether it's alternative theater or it's, they kind of crack down on political satire. So we move into rap and other forms of creative resistance. I think it is important to focus on those. In terms of, what this means for future outcomes, I think there are too many contingent factors to be able to give any kind of predictions. I think that there is, and I think that the reaction online to those two videos, the Susamam and the Olay videos, shows that there is this simmering dissent. The question is, what is the catalyst? What provokes it? And what gets people into the streets? And in the US, it was the murder of George Floyd. And not just George Floyd, but a number of other individuals that led up to this just frustration and outpouring. I don't know what that catalyst would look like in Turkey. I would assume, they've removed so many of the mayors in Kurdish municipalities, for example, but they haven't tried to remove Ekrem İmamoğlu yet. They have threatened to. Süleyman Soylu did. He also threatened against Mansur Yavaş in Ankara. They have tried to investigate them for the charity work that they tried to do to raise funds for families during the corona pandemic. Those investigations are being carried out against those local opposition mayors. So I think it would be something that would be that big of a deal that you would see people pouring out into the streets or taking their protest online. But then you have the calculations of the regime, right? And what is their threshold for the use of violence? And what is their calculation in terms of what they're willing to do? So, studying protest is so fascinating from the sort of the ground up perspective. But just as we saw in that incident yesterday that I described with, the young African-American man telling the crowd, don't throw water bottles, don't do that. Had he not done that, the entire scene could have ended differently. It could have ended in a deadly fashion. So protest and the study of collective resistance is a field filled with contingencies. So it makes prediction pretty tough.
Right. It must be even more difficult when those protests are not in public. They kind of move underground.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And as a researcher, how do you study those? And if you do, because, a lot of us researchers are tenure track professors who are trying to publish things and stay in our careers. And how do we write on them when we can't write on them, right? Because you don't want to expose these movements. So there's ethical questions in the study of these kinds of things as well. So you're absolutely right. It's a conundrum, but I hope to see scholars continuing to focus on these creative forms of resistance.
Okay. Lisel Hintz of Johns Hopkins University and author of Turkey, Identity, Politics, Inside and Out. Thanks so much for your insight on these protests. It's been a pleasure. And I'm looking forward to your upcoming writing you mentioned.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, David. It's always a pleasure.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.